I rise to support this important motion that has been moved by the member for Vass. And I do wish to contribute to the justifiable criticism of this Labor government's failure to respond in a meaningful way to the significant surge in cost of living pressures faced by Western Australians. And I might say, given the themes of the previous two speakers, in particular, the impact on local services. Now, history shows there's always been modest inflation typically, and that people can manage it, and that's certainly been true over the last few years where inflation has been extremely low. But we also know that there are always a good number of households who are simply struggling and battling to get from pay packet to pay packet, and that's households. And as was pointed out by both members previously, of course, there are all too many people in a community who in fact don't have a household, whether that's a household that they're buying or own or that they're renting. Now, this year has been quite exceptional in comparison to the past number of years, and that is we're experiencing a surge of inflation that's been brought on by a number of factors, but certainly some economic shocks. It's the biggest surge in inflation in over 30 years. And the initial rise in inflation did stem from the impact of COVID in terms of impact on the cost of production of goods and the restriction on the supply of goods in particular and farm produce around the world. But the supply chain has continued to see rapidly rising price impacts. And of course then we've had the global shock which around energy prices, which whilst energy prices in Western Australia, fuel prices, as I'll go into some detail, have seen some significant rise. At least our household, the intrinsic price rises are there by government, not because of the impact of any sort of global supply issues, but because in other parts of the world, the war in Ukraine has had an impact on that. Now, the combination of those economic factors has really sent economic shockwaves into our community, and it's sent inflation rising, well, as I've said, at the highest rate for over 30 years. And really you probably have to go back to the energy crisis in the 1970s to see a period where prices are rising more sharply. Now, those pressures from the increasing cost of food, manufactured goods, business imports, transport, have been exacerbated by the price rises applied by this government, and of course also confounded by the price rises in rents and mortgages, which I will go on to talk a bit about, which in this state do come back to the feet of this government as well. Now, the result of all those factors has been that what we've seen is a stellar rise, and I have a chart here of looking at inflation. This is going back to 2019, and quite stellar, and members can see on this graph. And if we see, we were sitting at around a 1.5% inflation rate, or in fact a 1% inflation rate for significant periods of time, or even below. And the latest figures have us sitting at an inflation rate of around 7.5% or a little bit more. Now, that means that in this state, the cost for households is rising at 7 times what it has been over the past few years, and that has caused major difficulties for households. Now, I want to go into a little bit of detail in relation to some of these impacts, because sometimes in this place I think that there's a tendency to look at sort of hear numbers and hear figures and so on and say, well, yeah, so what? Well, these are just things that happen. And I suspect for most members of Parliament, whilst they see those price rises, are not in that category of people who are in desperate straits. But again, if we look at housing rates, and we go back sitting around 4%, and then of course those went down quite dramatically going next year, and then what have we seen? But this massive uptick in mortgage rates in Western Australia and in Australia, and as a consequence in Western Australia. Now, those mortgage rates have veritably leapt up. according to the Reserve Bank, they averaged 3.1% in March, and now it's almost 4.5%. So that's what the minimum that most houses are facing, I should say. Now that's roughly a 50% increase in mortgage payments for home buyers. And, a 1.4% rate in that case higher. That means an extra $7,000 per annum, or some $140 per week in interest payments on a $500,000 loan. And of course, for any organisation that has a property and has a mortgage or has loans associated with it, in many cases those costs are considerable. $7,000 just on an ordinary family within what is in fact below the average mortgage, or the median mortgage or the average mortgage, I should say, for households in Western Australia. And that's $140 a week out of someone's budget. Now, you would know, or some members in this place would know, that mortgage stress is a measure that's used by banks. Mortgage stress is where a household is spending more than 30% of its income on the servicing the mortgage for a house. And if you imagine that in terms of a household that was sitting on a high level of income, that 30%, they've had a 15% increase in that. And as I say, on top of the other household inflation figures is quite considerable. And if we look at mortgage stress, and I will talk a little bit about this in terms of the Premier's comparisons to other states, but there's an article by Miriam Fisher in Perth Now on August the 4th, which is reasonably contemporaneous, but talking about mortgage stress in Western Australia. This article goes through, looks at the RBA figures, and then refers to the Ativo Mortgage Stress Report, which has come out. And what that report points out is that at present, over a quarter of Western Australian homes are facing mortgage stress. There's 250,000 households in the state of Western Australia, given the normal sort of multiple, over 500,000 people being affected by mortgage stress. And that's an enormous impact on those households, and I find it fascinating that the Premier talks about this in the context of other states, and as was outlined by the Leader of the Opposition. To be frank, it doesn't matter what's happening in New South Wales. It doesn't matter what's happening in Victoria. That has no relevance whatsoever to those 500,000 Western Australians who are living in households who are worried about whether they can keep their house. They're prioritising what bills they don't pay. They're prioritising the things they don't buy. As I've said in this place before, they're not idle choices. It's parents deciding whether they'll eat or the kids will eat. Whether they'll buy their children shoes, whether their children can participate in school events and the like. And these are everyday distressing decisions facing those families. So, for the Premier to come in here and say, well, don't worry, everything in Western Australia is okay because things might be worse in New South Wales or Victoria, I just find it, gobsmacking perhaps is a poor choice of words, but nevertheless, something that beggars belief, because we have a very substantial number of people in Western Australia. This isn't just people who can't get jobs. These are people who, in many cases, have jobs, and of course, if we look at renting, then again I'll go through a little bit of detail of that. But the people of renting are essentially in the same sort of distressing position. Now, the median house rent now sits at $523 a week, and according to Rent West in 2020 it was $420. That's a 24.5% increase, or over $100 a week just in the past 2 years, adding to those other cost of living pressures. Now, we looked at all of those other impacts in relation to that, but when you add it to the looking at the impact of fuel prices in this state, and again, something I pointed out in this place before, rising fuel prices inevitably hurt people who are least able to afford them more, not only in the fact that rising fuel prices are a larger percentage of their income, but of course we know that as you move further from the CBD, as you move further to the fringes of Perth, typically they are lower socio-economic areas, and that means that the people who live furthest away, who rely more on vehicles for their transport to get to their jobs, in fact suffer a disproportionately greater impact on their household budget. And we can see, looking at average fuel prices, going from March 20 or June 20 through to current. I mean, it was around $1.20 to $1.10 actually, and then maybe ranging up to $1.30 a litre. And of course now we have fuel prices that are really approaching $2 a litre for the household. So again, a phenomenal increase in that particular cost. Now, it's effectively a 50% or more increase in those costs. Now, that's for many families is another $60 a week just in transport costs, just in fuel, if you look at those other costs. So those households that are being impacted just by those two things in terms of rent and fuel is $200 a week. And then, of course, we look at surging food prices and the like, which increases that again. Now, I know a young couple, they've just gone out, they've rented their first property. They tried to find a rental property. And again, the Leader of the Opposition has been through this in a little bit of detail in terms of availability of properties. But, for that young couple, they're a young couple, one studying, one working in I think a typical low-paid job of around $27 an hour. The weekly rent, the lowest rent they could possibly get, it was $420 a week. Half of their income for that young couple are going on rent. Half of their income. Now that's the only choice they have. They either do that or they have to find a way of bunking in with parents or relatives or friends. They have no other choice, and that is causing enormous distress for that young couple that I know. But of course, there are many other couples that are in an even more invidious position in relation to that. So, as I said, we're experiencing this enormous level of inflationary shock. And again, we hear from the Premier, well, I've done everything that I possibly can in relation to that. And we saw this, what I described previously as this sleight of hand of the $400 rebate that the Premier offered leading into the last federal election. And I note that. It was a rebate offered leading into the last federal election. That's what it was timed for. We all know that. It was timed to enhance the Labor vote in the state of Western Australia leading into the other election. But of course, he talks and he says, well, we haven't put up fees and charges because we're giving this $400 rebate. But of course, anyone in this place who's read the budget knows all of the underlying fees and charges, all of them, are increasing. All of them. So all of the underlying fees and charges have increased this year, and all of those underlying fees and charges are increasing by effectively the same amount next year. So what does that mean? That means next year that households, and that is from July next year, households are going to get a double whammy. They're going to get a double whammy. In fact, they're going to see 5% plus jumps in 1 year. So that's why I say this rebate is a sleight of hand. And the government has the opportunity to do about that. Now, if we look at that $400 rebate, in fact, it's only $300 because for the average house, underlying fees and charges have gone up by $100 in any case. But it was a $300 million package put forward by the government. And I want to contextualise that in the context of the last time the government sought to entice people to support them by offering a rebate. Now, as I've said, the Premier's got the audacity to say he's done everything, and I'll quote, we've done everything we can to make life as easy as possible for Western Australians in this difficult environment. Now, I would ask one person in this place to say that they truly believe that the Premier has done and his government has done everything we can to make life as easy as possible for Western Australians, because the reality is the government could do much more. As I said, we're facing the greatest inflationary shock of our history. But what we do have in this state is a budget surplus of $6 billion and 5 times greater than the $1.2 billion surplus budgeted in 2021. Now, just before the election, in that period, when we only had a budget surplus of $1.2 billion, the government put up $600 electricity credit and then also froze government charges for that period. That's an $800 million package this government put forward when the surplus was only estimated to be $1.2 billion. Now that we have a surplus of over $6 billion, the government's putting up a $300 million package. So it appears that before a state election, the government can contribute a large part of that surplus into the trying to provide some cost of living relief for households. But that we come into this period, suddenly it's reduced. And, you know, again, I'll hark back to the Premier makes these comments about the other states and what the other states are doing. The other states do not enjoy the revenue stream that we enjoy in this state. And I might say that increase in revenue, that budget surplus, is nothing whatsoever to do with any decision made by this government. Nothing whatsoever to do. That budget surplus is a result of 2 things. One is the GST fix that was put in place by the federal Liberal National Government under the excellent guidance of the Honourable Matthias Cormann, who was the Finance Minister at the time, working with the Treasurer at the time of the day. But of course the other is iron ore royalties and other mineral royalties, which this government has no control over whatsoever. So the government, can I have an extension please? Extension. The government puffs its chest out and says, we've done this great job of obtaining this surplus, but the government had nothing to do with that surplus coming forward in this state. But just as in comparisons to the other states on looking at house prices and other such things, this state is in a unique position compared to the other states. Uniquely, this state benefits and will continue to benefit for some time, certainly the GST fix for the foreseeable future, if we can trust this federal Labor government. But in relation to the mineral royalties, whilst we know that those mineral prices will come down for the foreseeable future, and then certainly in terms of the key minerals for the renewable sector, we're going to enjoy that for some period of time. But right now, this government could give households immediate one-off relief and relieve that massive jump that people are going to see in fees and charges next year by freezing fees and charges. That's why we've said do that now. It's a one-off step. It's a one-off step. That's what it is, and then you've got your other forecast and the forward estimates, your increases going forward. Because as I've said, households who are going to be on their knees, I think, by the middle of next year, are going to be belted with double the increase that they otherwise would have, because, as I said, underlying fees and charges have gone up. Now, it is very, very clear that the government can afford to do that, they can do that, and they should do that. Now, that is the absolute opportunity this government has, and I might say, just going back a little way, I said that. This problem with housing, the government likes to sort of say, well, it's not our fault. It's other factors that have caused all of this problem with the increase of housing, or the unavailability of housing in this state, and hence the follow-on unavailability of rental properties. One thing we said to this government, and on this side right at the start, of the COVID pandemic, and once we'd got through those initial stages of being uncertain about where that would go, was don't stop Labor coming into this state. Don't stop Labor coming into the state, because we knew and we said that if you do that, there will be ongoing economic consequences for the state after the COVID pandemic begins to wane. But what did this government do? this government, for political purposes, their strong on COVID approach, not only did they stop what you might call frivolous travel within the state, and we completely supported that. We said, you don't just want people coming over here for idle reasons, there should be an important reason. But of course they stopped workers coming into the state. And we see the absolute consequence of that now, so that in every sector, but more particularly in the building sector, they simply could not get workers. They simply did not have workers to build homes, to do all of that work. And some of you that I see the Minister for Homelessness on the other side of the chamber, who's intimately involved in housing, a very large percentage of the workforce in housing and in construction, even in the major construction of apartments, are in fact not the highly skilled trades. A large percent of that workforce are what we would call the semi-skilled, or I think you'd have to say semi-skilled, but some might say the unskilled workforce, and that is those people who do all of those important jobs that don't actually require a formal trade certificate and don't require a high degree of training coming to the state. But this government stopped that, and I might say, just as an aside, they stopped doctors and nurses coming into the state as well. And that's just dumbfounding. We wonder why we've got a shortage of doctors and nurses in our hospitals now, when we've got a government that actually stopped them coming into the state. Now, everyone in the medical sector that I spoke to at the time was apoplectic with concern about what that would mean for hospitals following the pandemic, and indeed that's played out. We cannot get the medical professionals we need in this state for the hospitals and to deal with all of the health issues, because this government in fact stopped that. It took a very, very long time to remove that. And as I say, it was political posturing. We knew we could safely bring a reasonable number of people into the state, and that wasn't done. Now, the government can do a lot more than it's done. It can freeze fees and charges, and including the power and water and the car registration. Now, that would be a fantastic win for Western Australians. That means that in the middle of next year, when none of these cost pressures are going to have gone away, when households have been exhausting their savings that they have, that they're not going to be belted with a double the fees and charges increase that they've seen over this year. The government can afford to do it, and we're saying the government should do that. And that means, because what's the consequence of that when it happens? The consequence of people not being able to afford their rent, the consequence of people losing their home, and of course there's a high probability of deflation on house prices. So that means that people who can't afford to service their home loans will likely end up with no home and a significant mortgage still hanging over their head, a significant debt hanging over their head. What that means is that all of those people are going to put even more pressure on the services that the member for Vass and the Leader of the Opposition have spoken about. Those people who desperately need help, those people who are working and in fact cannot afford anywhere to live and are in fact living out of their car. And we've heard a couple of tales, or I shouldn't say tales, we've heard a couple of worrying stories this afternoon about just how dire that is for a good number of people, and we're well out of the situation of you might say that typically you may have had people with serious mental health conditions or addiction issues and so on that and those people couldn't afford housing because they found it hard to maintain employment and to manage their expenses. But of course now we have people who are very capable of doing that, who are employed, but in fact cannot afford to even provide a shelter over their head. We're going to see more of that, and a contributor to that will be the rise in the fees and charges of this state government next year. That is going to add the pressure, and as we've already heard, those service organisations themselves are struggling, and many of them are trying to provide an increased demand, but in fact, because of the inflationary pressures eating away at their discretionary expenditure, have less capacity to do that. So it is a situation that this government can do more about. It's not acceptable for the Premier to say, well, I've done everything I can. And it's not acceptable that we only see the Premier intercede and come forward with something when an election is imminent, when a state election is imminent or a federal election is imminent, because that's precisely when the two relief packages have been timed. So, I think it's readily apparent we've got a Premier that's very focused on the political circumstance, very focused on ensuring his popularity remains high, and that he helps his party get re-elected, very focused on that, but not as genuinely focused on the welfare of Western Australians and the struggle that many Western Australians are facing. And of course, the thing is, this Labor government's got a history in relation to these massive fees and charges. We go back to the start of this government, in 17-18, we had a 10.9% electricity price rise and a 6% water price rise. So they thought they'd do the old trick of they'll come in, they'll whack charges up, and then they'll, as we get to the election, as we saw, they sort of offer this freeze and rebate, say, oh, look, we haven't done so bad. But of course, all that is those underlying charges increased. The supply charges for electricity went up 95% at that time. Now, the cumulative inflation over the past 5 years was 9.8%. You have a supply charge going up 95%. And again, I'll say, in relation to these charges, whether it's a sewerage connection fee or whether it's the electricity supply charge, I mean, does that affect some billionaire living in their house in my electorate? They don't even notice it. I doubt they even have to worry themselves about actually paying those bills. They'll have someone employed to do it, and it's a blip on a landscape. But of course, for someone who's on a low fixed income, or in fact a lot of people are actually just on uncertain part-time work, they're the fees that hurt most. Those fixed fees and charges that no one can avoid in a household, they're the charges that hurt the poorest people most, the people most in need, the people that you say you represent, and yet you belted them with these massive increases, and there was nothing, literally nothing they could do, nothing that they could do about it. Now, and then we saw this really cruel exercise of hitting larger families, and that's all it did. We went through this in some detail before, but this supposed fee to decrease or discourage people from using water, but the massive increase in the charge for over 500 kilolitres of water charges, and all it did was belted large families, and I might say living in the eastern and northern electorates, more on the fringes of the city. That was very clear from the data that came out of this. They were the people that got hit again, the people that in fact members in this place do now represent. But in fact, they were the people who paid most, and as many of you would know, typically families that can least afford any of those increases. So, that was just an attack on large families. And as I say, wastewater charges, we saw those significant increases. Perhaps the member for Moore may talk about the toilet tax, but again, a massive hike in relation to people who are trying to run small businesses, but are taxed on every single toilet they have, whether a room or a building is occupied or not. Now, as I've said, we hear these lame excuses from the government. We hear them going back, to the Gallup or to the court here or something, and saying such and such happened. That may make for good politics. That may make for a bit of a grab here, or it may excite some of the backbenchers who like to hear you sticking it up, or sticking it to, I should correct myself, it to the opposition, and saying various pejorative things about them. However, it offers no solace whatsoever for the people in Western Australia that are suffering these preventable fees and charges increases in Western Australia, and more particular, it provides no solace for them when it hears a Premier saying that he's done everything he can, when it's quite clear that there is a capacity to give relief during this period of high inflation. Now, we hear that inflation maybe will come down in 12 months' time, but right now, households in Western Australia need help. We need help to prevent more people having to rely on the services, and those services themselves, which are under considerable stress because of inflationary pressures, but also fees from this government.